Her husband went on a business trip and went missing, while her mother-in-law started talking about the inheritance. And as soon as the wife learned from the notary what awaited her, the branches of the trees creaked monotonously under the force of a strong, misty autumn wind. The leaves had long since fallen, exposing bare branches that no longer pleased the eye, but instead evoked feelings of melancholy and sadness. The window, covered with a gray veil of rain, reflected the gloomy face of Grace Mitchell. "Another day wasted," she muttered. She stood with her forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the raindrops slide down the surface, like the tears that had not left her eyes for a month. It had been a month since Scott left for his business trip, and her world had turned upside down. The car he was driving had been found in the river, but no body was ever recovered. Scott's mysterious disappearance left a deep wound in Grace's soul, one that grew wider with each passing day. It was a time filled with worrying news, empty promises, and a suffocating sense of hopelessness. "He'll come back," Grace whispered a voice inside her. But her mind clung desperately to another, darker version of events, the one that had first been hinted at in whispers, and then spoken aloud, with growing certainty, by her mother-in-law, Mildred. To Grace's great surprise, her mother-in-law had been unwavering in her belief that her son was dead. She insisted there was no other explanation, and that Scott's car couldn't have just ended up in the river by chance. There was a hidden accusation in Mildred's voice, as if she suspected her daughter-in-law of somehow being involved in what had happened. "You need to understand, Grace," Mildred had said coldly, her tone detached. "Scott is gone. You need to accept that and move on. My Scott was always kind, generous, but life is unpredictable. You must claim the inheritance. It's your right. They say he even left a will, as if he sensed something. Do I even need this? A will, an inheritance? Let it all burn," Grace thought bitterly to herself. Deep down, she had long known that Mildred had always hated her, ever since Scott had chosen a simple schoolteacher over the perfect match his mother had picked for him. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to talk about this right now," Grace whispered, knowing full well that her words meant nothing to her mother-in-law. "Well, you know, be more practical, dear," Mildred said, approaching closer with her sharp smile. "Life goes on, and you need to think about Jeremy's future." At the mention of her son, Grace flinched and looked at her mother-in-law with a heavy heart. Their adopted boy, with his large brown eyes and a soul as sensitive as Grace's own, was sitting in his room, drawing in his sketchbook. Even though Jeremy was only 8, he understood all too well what was happening. He could feel the tension in the house, and nearly every day, he saw tears on his mother's face. It was Grace who had always cared for him, read him books, and even played with his toy cars, far better than Scott ever had. "Mama, is Papa coming home soon?" Jeremy asked, without looking up from his drawing. Grace walked over, sat beside him, and hugged him around the shoulders. It broke her heart to see the sadness in his eyes. "I hope so, sweetheart," she sighed, though she didn't believe it herself. "Why does Grandma keep saying that Papa won't come back?" Jeremy asked, finally looking up at her. "Grandma is just worried," Grace murmured, trying to hold back her tears. "Sometimes people say things they don't mean." "Did Papa really drown?" the boy asked, his voice filled with such despair that it made Grace's heart ache with pity. She looked at her son, and a newfound certainty glimmered in her eyes. She couldn't lie to him or hide the painful truth, no matter how harsh it was. "Jeremy, we don't know for sure," she said softly, "but we're hoping very much that he's alive, even though his car was found in the river." "So, he drowned," Jeremy whispered, his lips trembling. "There's no proof of that yet," Grace replied, pulling him closer. "We have to believe and hope for the best. We'll pray that he comes back to us alive." At that moment, Mildred entered the room. She cast a disdainful look at the mother and son embracing. "Well, are you putting on another show of tears?" she asked challengingly. Grace looked at her mother-in-law with worry. "Here we go again. Now there's going to be a scene." "Grandma," Jeremy said, his voice trembling, "why are you talking about Mama like that?" "Don't interrupt your elders, you little brat," Mildred replied with cold cruelty. Be grateful that soon, you and your precious mother will inherit my son's company. I don't want any inheritance, Jeremy whispered, burying his face in Grace's shoulder. I just want Papa to be alive. Grace stood up, shielding her son with her body, and looked at Mildred with undisguised regret. Please leave, she whispered, no longer trying to hide her emotions. Just leave us alone. Oh, so you're not ashamed? Mildred hissed. You should be mourning, but all you care about is your own comfort. Why aren't you wearing black in memory of my son? Do you think you're too good for that, being just a plain school teacher? Acting all high and mighty, I've seen women like you before, you're all the same. Grace merely shook her head, trying her best to ignore the harsh words. She had long realized that Mildred had always hated her, and now that Scott was gone, her mother-in-law's resentment had only grown stronger. Deep down, Grace couldn't accept the thought that her husband was gone for good. There was still a flicker of hope in her heart, faint and fragile as it was. She believed Scott was alive, somewhere out there, and that he would come back to his family. She remembered their last conversation before his business trip. Scott had mentioned some powerful people involved in shady dealings. Repeatedly, he warned her that his life was in danger, urging her to be careful and to trust no one. Grace had gone to the police just 3 days after Scott's disappearance, telling them everything he had said. But that information had proved almost useless. According to his colleagues, Scott Mitchell had been involved in a risky real estate business, often dealing with disgruntled clients. None of them, however, seemed likely to go so far as to resort to violence. Threats were one thing, but actually carrying out a dangerous plan that could cost them their freedom for at least 12 years? That was another matter. Despite everything, Grace clung to the belief that Scott was alive. You have to move on with your life, darling, her friend Cheryl Moore had said, trying to comfort her. You can't wait forever for someone who might never come back. But Grace couldn't accept those words. Her life was inextricably tied to Scott, and without him, she saw no future for herself. After the unpleasant conversation with her mother-in-law, Grace sat in the living room watching TV. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Her heart stopped for a moment, and a glimmer of hope sparked in her eyes. She rushed to the door and flung it open. Standing there was a young detective in uniform. Grace Mitchell, he asked. Yes, that's me, she answered, struggling to contain her anxiety. Senior Major Ernest Ortiz. You need to come with us to the morgue. We've found your husband's body. Be prepared for what you may see. At that moment, Grace's vision blurred, and she collapsed to the floor. Her hopes shattered into a million pieces. Her world disappeared in an instant. The sharp smell of ammonia from a piece of cotton, offered by her mother-in-law, brought her back from the haze. Grace quickly threw on a coat and slipped on her shoes. Her mother-in-law refused to go, surprising the detective. In the car, Grace felt like she was trapped in a fog. She couldn't think of anything other than the news of the body's discovery. Her thoughts spun wildly, tangled with horror, fear, and the faintest lingering hope. The morgue, an endless stretch of sterile, lifeless space, steeped in the smell of formaldehyde and despair. The long, tiled hallways seemed to go on forever. Clutching the detective's hand for support, Grace felt the ground slipping away beneath her feet. The sharp scent of disinfectants was so overwhelming that it took her breath away. Fortunately, as promised, Ernest led her directly to the table where the man's body lay. Grace froze. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. This was the moment of truth. In just a second, she would either become a grieving widow or be granted a brief reprieve, offering hope for just a little longer. She stared hard, searching the face of the deceased for the familiar features of her beloved. But the man before her was not Scott. It's not him, Grace whispered, letting out a soft sob. Are you certain? It's been quite some time, though the body is in relatively good condition, the approaching coroner asked. I'm sure. This is not Scott. Sorry, there must have been a mistake, the detective said, his voice betraying his own shock at the turn of events. I'll call Mildred and let her know. But Grace wasn't going home just yet. At Detective Ernest's suggestion, she was shown some photographs at the police station, pictures of Scott's belongings found near the unidentified body. The man had apparently died from alcohol intoxication. As Grace looked at the images, she recognized items that were unmistakably Scott's: his notebook, his favorite pen, and his lighter. A strange sense of relief washed over her. "We'll send a team to the region where these were found," Ernest said after Grace confirmed the items likely belonged to Scott. "As soon as we have any results, we'll contact you." Grace left the station feeling lighter than she had in over a month. Hope flickered back into her heart. She was certain now Scott was alive, and he would come back to her. She returned home at dusk, turning down Ernest's offer to drive her. Grace wanted time alone, away from her mother-in-law's biting comments, full of venom and disdain. And those constant talks about inheritance, what did that matter to her? Scott's business, built around real estate sales? What did she know about that world? Grace's true realm had always been English language and literature. There, she was a magician, crafting miracles with the stroke of a pen through elegant sentences and graceful turns of phrase. The evening park was quiet and cool, wrapped in the gentle hush of falling leaves, red and gold beneath her feet, as if whispering a final farewell to summer. Grace walked slowly, lost in thought. Her mind, like the autumn wind, swirled with sadness and melancholy. Suddenly, a faint cry reached her ears from somewhere nearby, so soft it was almost lost in the rustling leaves. Grace stopped, listening. The sound was coming from a lilac bush. "Who's there?" she asked quietly, afraid of her own voice. The crying grew louder, more insistent. She carefully approached the bush and froze. Nestled inside a woven basket, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a tiny infant. His small hands were tucked close to his chest, his lips quivering, eyes wet with tears. Grace turned her head and caught sight of a woman running away down the path. She was slight, with dark hair, her face hidden under a hood. "Wait!" Grace called after her, but the woman only quickened her pace. Grace rushed to the basket and scooped up the baby. He was shivering with cold, his delicate fingers clutching at her clothing. "Don't be afraid, little one," she whispered, holding him tighter. "I'll take care of you." Her heart broke with pity. How could a mother abandon her child alone in the cold, dark park? Why? There were no answers to these questions. All Grace felt was a surge of tenderness and warmth, filling the emptiness that had consumed her since the morgue visit. It wasn't Scott, not her husband, but it was someone who needed her. Someone who demanded her love and care. "What should I do?" she whispered, gazing down at the baby's small, helpless face. Grace bent down and gently picked up the basket. As she walked along the dimly lit path, she felt something new, pure, and bright beginning to bloom within her. By the time she reached her home, climbed the steps, and entered the living room with the basket and baby in her arms, that feeling had grown stronger. "Grace, who is that?" Mildred exclaimed from the kitchen, where she had been waiting. "I found him," Grace replied, her tear-filled eyes lowered. "What? Where did you find him?" her mother-in-law asked, irritation seeping into her voice. "In the park," Grace explained, bringing the basket closer. "He was all alone." Mildred leaned in to take a look. Just a tiny baby. And what do you plan to do with him?" "It's nearly night." At that moment, Jeremy entered the room, his eyes widening in surprise. "Wow, look at him." "Mom, can we keep him?" "Please," he asked, his voice filled with excitement. Mildred snorted disdainfully. "Keep him? What, do you think this is an orphanage or some house of charity? You've all lost your minds." Grace shook her head, pulling the baby closer to her chest. In that moment, she knew she wouldn't give this child up, not for anything, not even under threat of death. And Mildred? Let her think what she wanted. Did she even have a heart? Mildred seemed ready to argue further, but Grace wasn't listening. Instead, she quickly went online and placed an order for urgent delivery: baby formula, diapers, bottles, pacifiers, and everything else the baby might need. Jeremy, meanwhile, was over the moon. He was already imagining having a little brother. What a gift! But Grace wasn't ready to make such conclusions just yet. First, she had to help the baby. What would happen next, only time would tell. The courier delivered the order within half an hour. Grace sighed in relief. Warm and safe inside the house, the baby smiled with his toothless little mouth and even tried to grab her finger with his tiny hand. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. Thoughts of Scott faded into the background. A grown man was one thing, but this little boy, so helpless and in immediate need of care, was another entirely. Grace had no children of her own and little experience with infants, as she and Scott had adopted Jeremy when he was already 5 years old. The only time she had ever held a baby was at the christening of her friend Kadia's daughter. But now, gazing at the small face of this child, Grace smiled. For the first time in a month, she felt hope for a new life, for love, for light. Mildred, though initially shocked, ended up helping Grace. Together, they bathed the baby, changed his diaper, and rocked him to sleep. Grace, while feeling a little awkward, was also overwhelmed with joy and calm. The baby, sensing her love and care, gradually settled down and fell asleep. The next morning, Grace, holding the baby in her arms, headed to the nearest police station. She also brought the basket with the baby's blanket and belongings, just in case. In the office of the investigator handling Scott's disappearance case, she stood nervously at his desk, gently cradling the child. "Ernest," Grace began hesitantly, "I know this might not be what you expect to hear, but I found a baby." The senior officer, used to hearing all kinds of stories, was slightly surprised but remained composed. "You found a baby?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Tell me more." Grace described everything that had happened in the park the previous evening in detail. "I just couldn't leave him there alone," she concluded, looking into the investigator's eyes. "I think he needs help." "Thank you, Grace," Ernest said, his voice full of gratitude and admiration. "You did the right thing, like a true mother and wife." "I just wanted to help," Grace replied softly, lowering her eyes in modesty. "We'll certainly do our best to find his parents," Ernest reassured her. "In the meantime, you can file a report, and we'll transfer the baby to an orphanage where he'll be well taken care of." "Thank you," Grace replied quickly, "but could I take care of him myself for now?" "Are you sure?" Ernest asked, eyeing her with some doubt. "Yes," Grace smiled softly, "I think it's something very important for me." "All right," the investigator concluded, "but keep in mind, this could slow down your search for Scott." "I understand, but I can't leave this baby alone," Grace insisted, her voice steady. Ernest nodded, realizing there was no changing her mind. "Very well. We'll keep you informed about the search for the baby's parents, and, of course, continue looking for your husband. If you don't mind, please leave the basket behind. I'll have a closer look at it. And my assistant will drive you home, just to be safe." Grace stepped out of the office, the baby in her arms. She was nervous, but at the same time, felt a surge of strength and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't give up. Now, she had a reason to fight, for her life, for the baby's life, and for the hope that Scott might still be alive. Meanwhile, the investigators took a careful look at the basket and noticed something Grace hadn't. The bottom was double-layered. Beneath the top layer, he found documents bearing the boy's name. The baby's name was Mike, and he was 3 months old. His mother, according to the papers, was Teresa Miller. "Well, this changes things," Ernest muttered to himself. "Looks like the mother was in such a rush, she forgot to take the documents. Or maybe she left them here on purpose." Shaking his head, Ernest spent the next hour at his computer, combing through databases, trying to find any information about the mother. Soon, he caught a break. The address listed in the documents led him to the right woman. Arriving at a rundown apartment building, he quickly confirmed with some elderly women sitting on a bench outside that Teresa Miller lived in the building, on the 5th floor. Ernest climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Just as he did, an elderly neighbor appeared in the hallway. Looking for Teresa, the elderly neighbor asked. She's not home. And who are you? Ernest quickly turned, flashing his badge. Senior Police Major. She's not home, you say? Do you have any idea where she might be? The neighbor's tone shifted immediately, darkening. I can't say for sure. But before her maternity leave, Teresa used to work at a candy kiosk in the city park. The Central Park? Ernest inquired curtly. No, not Central, she waved her hands. The park just past the bridge, on the left. Maybe she went there? She grew up in an orphanage, you know. Perhaps she felt drawn back to familiar faces? Ernest didn't wait for more. Something inside told him he needed to hurry. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an urgency pounding in his chest. Racing down the stairs, he sped to his car and pushed it to its limit, flying down the main road towards the bridge. His mind raced as fast as his heart. God, why is my heart racing like this? Why can't I calm down, he thought, switching gears and accelerating. Soon enough, Ernest found the reason for his unease. As he drove onto the bridge, he saw a woman standing at the edge, just beyond the parapet. The wind whipped her hair, and in her eyes, frozen in fear, he recognized the desperation of a woman on the brink. He knew immediately this was Teresa, Mike's mother. Please, don't do this, Ernest shouted as he ran toward her. We found your son, he's alive and well. Teresa turned slowly, and as she recognized the man in uniform, she began to sway. Her eyes were filled with hopelessness, and suddenly, she broke down, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. I don't want to live anymore, do you hear me? Please, don't try to stop me, she sobbed, her grip on the railing weakening as she started to slide off the bridge's edge. Please, Ernest pleaded. Take a breath. In and out. Your life matters. Think of your child, of Mike. My son? Teresa wept bitterly. He's the son of that scumbag. Scott Mitchell. He left me the moment he found out I was pregnant. I didn't know what to do. I'm all alone. I have no one. Everything will be all right, Ernest said, his voice calm and steady. You need help, and I'll make sure you get it. The thought that the missing Scott Mitchell had left his mark here too, destroying the life of an innocent woman, shook the investigator to his core. Although it could have been mere coincidence, he no longer believed in such things. A minute later, he helped Teresa down from the railing and seated her on a bench, soothing her as they waited for the ambulance called by onlookers. You really need to see a doctor, Ernest urged her. I will do my best to help you. Scott. Teresa whispered softly, her voice filled with despair. Scott. He was the only one I wanted to tie my life to. He courted me beautifully, promised to marry me. Gifts, bouquets, flowers. We even celebrated the anniversary of our first date every month. Candles, wine, dates. Like in the movies. Teresa recounted how she had met Scott, how he had enchanted her and made her fall in love with him. Their romance had been brief but incredibly passionate. Deep down, she had never been sure of his serious intentions, but she had believed his words of love. Their happiness had been fragile and short-lived. I didn't know he was married. Teresa sobbed. He just told me he had complicated relationships and was breaking up with an ex who had disappointed him. And when did you find out about his lies? Ernest asked. When I saw him with his wife, Teresa said through tears. That's when I realized Scott had been lying to me all along. That was the moment I understood he didn't love me. When I told him I was pregnant, that scoundrel said it was my problem. Figure it out however you want. Just like that. I initially considered having an abortion, but when I went in on the appointed day, I ran out of the office in tears. I couldn't bring myself to part with my own flesh and blood. But you decided to keep your child, the investigator deduced. I didn't want to. Teresa clenched her fists. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to die. My distant aunt kicked me out of the house as soon as she saw my belly. I don't have a mom or dad. They died in a river accident. My Aunt Wanda initially disowned me, sent me to an orphanage. But when she found out the government had increased the allowances for children, she took me back. I understand, Ernest said gently. You need help. We will find a psychologist who can help you. My aunt said I should give the child up for adoption, since I didn't have the spirit to go through with an abortion. I wanted to write a refusal, but a kind-hearted midwife, Rosa Brown, persuaded me otherwise. She gave me things for the baby from the Newborn Assistance Fund, and I had a one-room apartment, as was due to me as an orphan, Teresa continued. But it had never been repaired. The roof leaks, and now that it's autumn, I went to the housing office, but they just keep asking for money. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought it would be better for Mike to be in another family where he wouldn't be mistreated. Ernest felt chills run down his spine as he listened to the young mother's story. God, could such things really happen in real life? Soon the doctors arrived. Ernest walked Teresa to the ambulance and whispered in her ear, "You are not alone." After standing at the edge of the bridge for a moment longer, the investigator smiled at the turbulent waves of the majestic river and returned to his car. On the way back to the station, Ernest kept pondering whether to tell Grace the truth or not. However, why hide it when everything would soon come to light anyway? You can't keep a secret in a sack forever. And that Scott, what kind of man is he? He abandoned not only his wife and adopted child, but also his pregnant mistress. What sort of man does that? Ultimately, upon entering his office, Ernest dialed Grace's number and told her everything as it was. I found the boy's mother. His name is Mike, he's 3 months old, and his mother is Teresa Miller, the former lover of your husband. Scott left her when he found out she was pregnant. Teresa was going to take her own life today. Grace felt her head spin. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Scott, her beloved Scott, was not the person she had always thought he was. Is it really true? Grace whispered. He left her and his child? Yes, the investigator confirmed, and he probably hid his connection with Teresa from you. Of course, how could I have known? Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. I always believed him, I loved him. Well, love can be blind, Ernest said gently, but sometimes it helps to see the truth. Feeling lost and unsure of how to continue her life, Grace hung up the phone and broke down in tears. Ernest winced, realizing that Grace and Teresa's fates had intertwined in a complex knot of life that would be difficult to untangle. Unfortunately, in his investigation, he hadn't made any progress toward unraveling the mystery of Scott's disappearance. Where was he, and was he even alive? A month had passed, and no bodies had been found. Frankly, this was the first time Ernest was dealing with such complicated cases. Meanwhile, Grace, locked away in her room, quietly cried. She kept her sobs soft so as not to wake little Mike, who was sweetly snoring in the cradle she had bought for him. Jeremy was asleep in the nursery and couldn't hear that his mother was feeling very unwell at the moment. Despite this, Grace felt no resentment toward the baby, fully aware that he was born from Scott's affair with his mistress. Unbeknownst to herself, Grace gradually calmed down and mentally sank into the serene days of her childhood. She immersed herself in the hallways of the hospital where her mother worked as a nurse and the garage where her father met his tragic end. The cool, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hospital had been Grace's playground from an early age, filled with the distinct smells of bleach and medicine, where the staff was clad in white from head to toe. Grace would run through the hallways, imagining herself an explorer uncovering mysterious secrets. In her mother's office, she curiously watched rows of white coats and sparkling medical instruments. Back then, she secretly dreamed of becoming just like her mother, a healer helping others. "Mom, can I help?" Grace would ask, her big eyes sparkling with inner excitement. "Of course," Evelyn would gently reply. "You can organize these bandages." Grace loved feeling like part of something very important, being an adult, responsible. In contrast, the atmosphere at her father Bruce's bus depot was entirely different. The smell of gasoline and motor oil mingled with the clanging of tools and the humming of engines. Grace enjoyed sitting on her father's lap for long stretches, watching his confident movements and listening to his stories about the world of buses. "Dad, I want to be an engineer like you," she proudly declared, even though just a couple of hours earlier, she had told her mother that she would become a nurse. "I'm sure you can achieve anything you want," her father responded, gently kissing her forehead. But fate had other plans. The fire that broke out during firefighting efforts at the bus depot mercilessly consumed her father, leaving a deep wound in the hearts of those who loved him. Grace shuddered at the flood of memories, and a tear slowly rolled down her cheek. She never forgot her father and always remembered his words. A scene from that fateful day flashed in her mind. Her mother stood at the city morgue's door, her eyes filled with agony and unspeakable sorrow. Grace rushed into her embrace, sobbing and seeking comfort. "Mom, why did Dad have to die?" she whimpered through her tears. "He was a hero, Grace," Evelyn replied, clenching her hands into painful fists. "Dad saved many lives. He got behind the wheel of a burning bus and drove it out of the lot because half the buses in the depot ran on propane. Just imagine if they had all exploded. School was just a stone's throw away. Sweetie, your dad couldn't allow that." In the years that followed, Grace often held her father's posthumously awarded medal and cried. He made his choice, not for himself, of course, but for the safety of the city's residents who could have become victims of a massive fire. Grace gradually learned to live with this tragedy, finding solace in books and her mother's words. She also made a promise to herself to succeed in whatever she pursued to honor her father's memory. However, she never became a nurse or an engineer, ultimately choosing to become a middle school teacher instead. Grace's thoughts drifted back to her carefree student years when everything seemed simple and full of hope. The pedagogical university became her new dream and calling. Once again, Grace saw herself as a student surrounded by new friends. Unknown subjects, exciting lectures on education methodology, psychology, and development flashed before her eyes. Each day was filled with new discoveries, connections, and, of course, first love. "Grace, did you hear?" Jessica Richards bounced up to her, glowing with excitement. "There's going to be a dance competition at our university. Can you believe it? A dance competition?" Grace echoed, slightly surprised. "But why do we need that? We're future teachers, not dancers." "But it's not just any competition. It's an event for boosting spirits, socializing, meeting new people, and, well, don't we want to have a little fun?" her friend winked. "Just think how great it will be." Although Grace wasn't particularly fond of dancing, she ultimately succumbed to Jessica's persuasion and decided to participate. After all, it was a perfect opportunity to take a break from the endless textbooks, notebooks, and tests. Preparing for the competition turned out to be no easy task. Grace and Jessica, to put it mildly, weren't very good dancers, and they struggled to master the complicated moves. "Grace, you're moving so clumsily." Jessica laughed, demonstrating more graceful movements. "Have you ever taken any dance classes?" "Well, I attended a ballroom dance club for a couple of months when I was a kid," Grace replied shyly, lowering her gaze. 2 months? Jessica shook her head, barely containing her laughter. "It's no wonder you dance like a bear on ice." But Grace decided not to give up. She practiced diligently, repeating the movements over and over again, trying to improve her technique just a little bit. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. From the very first moments, anxiety gripped Grace in its iron grip. Her heart raced like crazy. "Grace, it's going to be fine." Jessica squeezed her hand. "You can do this." As they stepped onto the stage, Grace felt absolutely awkward. The music started, and she and her friend began to dance. Oh, how she wished she could disappear at that moment. The moves came out awkward, and her movements were anything but graceful. Suddenly, she felt herself stumble and fall. An oppressive silence hung in the hall. Grace turned as red as a lobster. At that moment, she literally wanted to sink through the floor. "Oh no, that didn't go very well," Jessica whispered, helping her up. I'm sorry, Grace mumbled, her face turning even redder, if that were possible. At that moment, she heard loud laughter. A tall, slender guy with cheerful eyes was laughing from the front row. He seemed unable to stop. "You're just amazing," he shouted, still chuckling. Grace was ready for anything, but not for such an absurd compliment. "What are you laughing at?" Jessica exclaimed, trying to defend her friend. "This isn't funny at all." Sorry, the guy shook his head, panting from laughter. "I just couldn't help it. I'm Scott," he introduced himself, apologizing again. "But your dance was incredibly funny." Still blushing from embarrassment, Grace tried to smile. "I'm Grace," she replied, replaying her awkward movements in her mind. After the competition, Scott approached her. "I'm sorry for laughing at you," he said, looking at her with sincere remorse. "It was just that you fell so unexpectedly. I mean, really." Grace smiled. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, she couldn't deny that Scott was very handsome and charming. He had a way of making people feel at ease. "It's all right," she said. "I laughed at myself afterward too." "You're really sweet," the guy said, gazing into her eyes. "Maybe we could get to know each other better." From that day on, Grace and Scott began dating. Their relationship developed rapidly. Scott was kind, attentive, and caring. He brought her flowers and wrote poetry. He took her to the movies and to the theater. "Hey, remember how you fell at the competition?" Scott laughed, wrapping his arms around her. "Oh, I still blush when I think about it," Grace replied. "I was so awkward." "But that's exactly what I liked about you," Scott said. "Your spontaneity, your sincerity." Cuddled up in the warmth of his embrace, Grace felt her heart swell with love and happiness. She realized that Scott was her destiny, the person she wanted to spend her whole life with. Their story began with an awkward fall and laughter but blossomed into something more beautiful and desirable. Her student years, filled with dreams and first love, would forever remain in her heart. Grace, as she had once dreamed, became a good teacher, but even more, a loving wife and mother. It didn't matter that she wasn't the biological mother of Jeremy, he was her adopted child. What mattered was the love and care she bestowed upon this less fortunate little one. Just thinking about Jeremy made Grace recall the years spent amidst endless pregnancy tests. The doctors shrugged their shoulders, spoke of vague diagnoses, complications, and some hereditary issues. "It could be a hormonal imbalance," the doctor said, looking at Grace with sympathy. "Try to relax, get some rest, maybe take a trip to the sea, and be sure to take your vitamins." "What if it doesn't work again?" Grace whispered, looking in the mirror at her exhausted, pale face. "Well, there's no need to get upset in advance," the doctor reassured her. "Modern medicine works wonders. We'll try different methods, and I hope we'll succeed." But time passed, and the miracles never came. "You know, Grace, maybe it's worth considering other options." "Like adoption," her doctors suggested one day. Grace froze in astonishment. Adoption, this word sounded like a ray of light at the end of an endless tunnel. She immediately envisioned a happy family, loving parents, and the laughter of a child. Grace had dreamed of this since childhood. But Scott was more reserved in his emotions. He loved Grace and worried about her, but he wasn't in a rush to become an adoptive father. "Scott, I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of these expectations and hopes that collapse in an instant. I'm afraid we'll lose each other if we keep searching for solutions in these endless medical procedures. I want a child. Now, not Sunday later. What about you? Are you ready to wait even longer?" Scott remained silent. His gaze was distant, as if looking into infinity. "I don't know, Grace. I have my business. You know how promising the real estate market is. I need time to think. I'll consult with my mother." Grace shook her head, fully aware of the advice Mildred would give her son. A few weeks later, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Grace took the initiative and found information about a children's home. She spent several sleepless nights reading through the documents, studying the stories and photographs of the children. In her soul, hope was born, stronger than the pain and despair. "Scott, I've made my decision. We're going to the children's home," she said, looking at her husband with a confidence she hadn't felt in a long time. Her husband frowned. "Grace, I told you we need time." "Scott, time is running out. I can't wait any longer. I want us to have a child. You understand this is a serious step. We're taking responsibility for someone else's child. What if he turns out to be difficult? What if he doesn't accept us? Scott, he's just a little child. He needs love, warmth, and a family, and we can give him that." Grace took her husband's hand. "Please, let's try. I'm sure we can do this." "Fine, just don't say I didn't warn you." The orphanage was quite cozy. Clean wallpaper, carpeted floors, flowers on the windows, mostly low-maintenance ones, just in case someone forgets to water them. "This is where children under 3 live," the caregiver said, "and the older ones are over there." Grace felt her hands grow cold and clammy with nervousness. She tried to push away her heavy thoughts and focus on the search. One thought echoed in her mind: to find her child. "Aren't you scared?" Scott whispered, glancing at the extremely cute faces of the children. "No, I'm afraid we won't find him." Grace's voice trembled slightly. "The child who will become our family." The children looked at the visitors with suspicion. Some hid behind their friends. Grace's heart ached with compassion for the little orphans. "And here's Jeremy," the caregiver pointed to a small boy sitting on a rug, playing with building blocks. He was small, thin, with big brown eyes, so fragile and defenseless that Grace immediately felt a wave of warmth in her chest, a feeling she thought she'd lost during her endless struggle with infertility. "Jeremy is a calm, good boy," the caregiver added, "but his story is a hard one. His mother abandoned him at the hospital." Grace stepped closer and smiled. "Hi, Jeremy." The boy looked at her warily. He was quiet and hardly spoke. "Do you want to play with us?" Grace knelt down and tried to pick up a piece of the building set. Jeremy pulled back. He clearly didn't want to play with these strange grown-ups. "Maybe later?" Grace suggested, glancing at Scott. Her husband stood off to the side, arms crossed. "Come on, he seems so uptight," her husband commented without a hint of embarrassment. "Let's look at some of the others instead." "No, Scott, this boy is ours. I can feel it. I can't explain it, but it's true." Scott sighed sadly. "Grace, please don't force things. I'm not ready. I want to spend a few more years just with you. Traveling, living for ourselves. A child, this is too serious." "Scott, this isn't just my child, it's yours too. We need to take responsibility. We can't leave him alone. He deserves happiness, and we can give it to him. Please, try to understand me." In the end, Scott agreed. But he didn't do it out of joy, he did it because he saw how much Grace was suffering. He saw her tears, her despair, and he didn't want his wife to be unhappy. "Okay, Grace," he said, looking at Jeremy, who was still playing with the blocks. "But I warn you, if he becomes fussy and starts getting in our way, I won't be able to put up with it for too long." Grace smiled, and tears glistened in her eyes. "Thank you, Scott." Jeremy looked up and gazed at the strange guests. In that moment, his eyes were full of joy and hope. Grace felt her heart fill with love. She was finally going to have a son. The next few months were challenging. Jeremy was shy and extremely distrustful. He didn't want to play with other kids and didn't talk to them on the playground. He just sat in a corner and stared into space. "Jeremy is so quiet," Grace said, watching her son. "Maybe he doesn't feel good with us?" "Oh, no, he just feels out of place," her husband replied. "He needs time to get used to us." In turn, Grace worked hard to earn her son's trust. She read him fairy tales, played on the playground, and made delicious dinners. Gradually, the little boy began to thaw. He started to smile more and interact with his peers. "Mom, I love you," Jeremy said one day, looking at her with tears in his eyes. Grace froze in place in astonishment. "I love you too, son." In that moment, the young mother's heart tightened with overwhelming tenderness. It was the most beautiful word in the world. Her son called her mom. Scott stood off to the side, watching them. There was something inscrutable in his eyes, something that Grace couldn't quite decipher. On the surface, her husband seemed happy, but there was a hint of sorrow lurking in his gaze. "He called you Mom," Scott remarked. "Yes, that's the most important thing," Grace replied. Jeremy was growing up, attending kindergarten, learning to read and write. He was a good boy, smart and kind. He loved his parents and appreciated their care. However, Scott never fully accepted Jeremy. He loved him, but his expression of that love seemed hidden and muted. Of course, it was clear that Mildred's influence was at play, as she was willing to do anything to ensure her son's comfort. But over time, things began to stabilize and fall into place. "You know, Grace," Scott said a year before his mysterious disappearance, "I'm starting to understand that you were right. Jeremy is our son, and I will love him as my own." Grace smiled, knowing her husband was speaking the truth, and she felt happy about it. Finally, her family seemed complete. However, this idyllic moment didn't last long. First, Scott disappeared, and then a series of revelations about his extramarital affairs and the unpleasant discovery of his mistress, Teresa, and her son, Mike, followed. Tired of the stream of memories, Grace found herself slipping into a troubled sleep, the kind a young mother experiences. Not from breastfeeding, of course, but still. How many times would she have to get up during the night to feed the baby with the prepared formula? Change his diaper or something else? Once, twice, maybe 3 times? Nevertheless, this night passed relatively calmly. Mike woke up only once and quickly fell back asleep after taking a few sips of warm milk. Suddenly, the phone on the nightstand came to life, interrupting the flow of thoughts in the young mother's mind. An unknown number. Grace frowned and reluctantly reached for it. "Hello," she whispered into the receiver, still not fully awake. "Grace, hello," a polite but firm voice came through the phone. "My name is Gerald Jenkins. I'm a notary. The thing is, we were in communication with your husband Scott, and he has made a will." Grace flinched. "Scott, a will? Is that what my mother-in-law has been harping on about? What do you mean?" "Scott left you the company Dream Home," the notary continued. "He was confident that you would be able to manage it if necessary. Dream Home was Scott's company that sold houses and apartments." Grace was aware of the firm, its plans and dreams, but she had no knowledge of the will. Why hadn't her husband told her anything? Grace struggled to find the right words. However, there is one but, the notary interrupted the prolonged silence. "Unfortunately, the company's affairs are not very good. There is a massive debt attached to it. The shareholders will soon put it up for auction." Grace felt as if she had turned to stone. Auction? Debt? How? Scott always seemed so successful and reliable to her. "What do you mean?" "Unfortunately, Grace, the situation is extremely complicated. The debt is very large, and it appears you will not be able to or want to pay it off. The company will be sold at auction." Her heart clenched with pain, fear, and confusion. She couldn't understand what was happening, why Scott had done this to her, and why he had left her this ticking time bomb. Tears welled up in her eyes as the warm morning suddenly turned cold and unpleasant. "Thank you for the information," she barely breathed out before hanging up. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the phone tightly in her hands. Thoughts tangled and whirled in her head, making it impossible to concentrate. What if Scott's disappearance was not accidental at all? Before she could fully process what had happened, the phone rang again, pulling her from her stupor. This time, it was a familiar number, Senior Major Ernest Ortiz, the investigator handling the search for her missing husband. "Grace, are you awake?" I have astonishing news for you. Your husband has been found, or rather, detained at the airport. Scott? Grace exhaled in disbelief. Yes, the investigator confirmed he was carrying a fake passport and was trying to flee the country. Why would he do that? Grace was completely bewildered. We believe, the investigator continued, that he intentionally staged his death and then transferred all the company's debts to you through the will. He preferred to disappear. Based on my experience, he likely has his reasons, possibly related to his business or some debts. Grace felt faint. Everything suddenly made sense. Scott had betrayed her. He had abandoned her and their child to fend for themselves. He had deceived and used her. How could he do this? Grace felt on the brink of losing consciousness from the overwhelming surge of emotions. Grace, Ernest's voice softened, understand that sometimes people act in ways that are hard to explain. Your priority now is to calm down. Calm down, she sobbed. How can I calm down when my husband is a criminal? The investigator hardly knew how to answer that question. What could he say when he was just as shocked by the blatant lies of the runaway businessman? As it turned out later, Mildred had known about her son's scheme and had helped him in every way possible, maintaining the facade of his death. Scott had planned his escape for several months, ever since he found out about his mistress's pregnancy. He certainly did not intend to become a father. But since it had come to this, he decided to start a new life, killing several birds with one stone. The problem lay not only in his extramarital affairs, but also in significant debts stemming from a series of failed bets on underground horse races at the local racetrack. Scott realized too late that he had lost almost half of his assets. On top of that, he still had to pay taxes and settle overdue wages for employees who had not received their salaries from the boss for 2 months. That was when the businessman conceived the idea of staging his own death and then fleeing the country with his latest mistress, Amanda Palmer. By deliberately crashing his car into a river, Scott left his jacket with personal belongings on the shore, which was later discovered by an unsuspecting drifter. However, there was one hitch in the whole story that the investigator couldn't quite understand. Why had the drifter, who found the businessman's jacket, himself become a victim and ended up on the autopsy table? Ernest pondered this question for a long time. And when he interrogated Scott once again, he finally understood the reason. The drifter had seen the businessman staging his own death and could have reported it to the police. Scott wrestled with his doubts for about a week before finding the very drifter and, on his mistress's advice, decided to get him drunk until he passed out, then drown him in the river. To the fugitive entrepreneur's surprise, the drifter flatly refused to drink with him and even threw the unopened bottle into the bushes. However, when Scott stormed off in frustration, the man couldn't resist the temptation and, secretly uncorking it, drank it to the bottom. This sealed the drifter's fate, as the bottle contained a potent poison. Unbeknownst to him, the drifter inadvertently saved Scott, because had he taken even a sip, he would have ended up alongside him on the coroner's table. But where did the poison come from? Scott swore he knew nothing about it, and Ernest could see that he was clearly not lying. The truth was shocking. The poison had been added to the bottle by his new lover, Amanda, who had set her sights on the stolen company money. Determined to eliminate both the drifter and Scott in one go, the femme fatale was confident she would get away with it and soon become a wealthy woman at someone else's expense. But, as is often the case, everything went awry from the plan she had devised. Scott remained safe and sound, while Amanda had to come to terms with the prospect of moving abroad together with him. Of course, it would be temporary, but still. It goes without saying how furious the businessman was when the investigator arranged for a confrontation between him and Amanda. The former lovers exchanged all sorts of accusations against each other, just to wriggle out of potential criminal charges. But all of it turned out to be in vain. The trial of the fraudsters was swift and just. Grace was present in the courtroom, providing witness testimony. Teresa, on the other hand, refused to speak with the authorities and, after leaving Grace's son to the guardianship council, moved to the other side of the country in search of a better life. Grace was satisfied with the court's verdict and left alongside Ernest, who had become her guardian angel. After the shameful ordeal, Mildred left her daughter-in-law's home and went to a women's monastery to atone for her sins and her son's misdeeds. Grace chose not to take the money that Scott hadn't managed to transfer abroad. Instead, she first paid the salaries of the firm's employees, and after selling the company at auction, donated the remaining funds to the local orphanage for renovations and new furniture for the children. 6 months later, Grace and Ernest got married, and as happy parents of 2 little ones, they set off on a honeymoon to the sea. Jeremy took care of his little brother, even occasionally feeding Mike with formula from a bottle under the watchful eye of his beloved mother. Seeing this touching scene, Ernest couldn't hold back his tears. After all, it is said that children are the flowers of our lives, and the more there are, the more beautiful and fulfilling it becomes. All of this rushed through his mind as he gazed at his beloved Grace's rounded belly. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.